Now we're on Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis. Uli Isha the Alma ain't get. If a man commissions the writing of a get, and he tells his sofa, write a get, I'm going to marry this woman, and then I want this get to be prepared now so that I can divorce her after I marry her. But he's not married to her at all. He hasn't yet implemented even eris. Ain't no get. That's not a valid get. The lishma cannot generate the chal shem get. At this point, he cannot be megarish. It's not like an arusa. This is before eris. Boy, Rami Bar Chama, liyavimto mahu. If a man tells the sofer before yibum, after she falls for yibum, to write a get, and I'm going to deliver this get after the yibum, what's the status of this get? On the one hand, we could be machshir the get, like the case of Arusa, Kevan Dagida Bey. There is a zikas yibum. Karusaso damya. We consider the Yevamot as if she is married to him. It's like eris. For example, there's an Isa Lavdo, Raisa Yevamot Shuk. Till she gets chalitza, she can't marry anyone else. So therefore, when he writes a get as a yavam, it's equivalent and identical with a get that was written to an arusa, on the condition that he'll use the get, he'll divorce her after Nisuin. Oh, Dilma, what's the other side to differentiate between arusa and agidabe and yavam? Oh, Dilma kaven delo avad ba maimar lo. Shall we say that this get is not kosher legarish when he commissioned it during the state of zikas yibum and he wasn't yet miyabima? This get will not be able to be used at all even after yibum. It's possible. And not only is it possible, the Rosh claims, we'll try to think about this Rosh in a minute, that if he delivered that get, she would not be psula laguna. If he died later, she could marry a Kohen. The get is invalid. Why? Because he hasn't yet done maimah. And apparently in this side of the Gemara, we reject the concept of Agida Beik Arusa. So she's not like an Arusa. And we've discussed this before, that Zikas Yibum is not on the level of Eris. Teku, we're left with an unanswered question. Now, Tosas disagrees with the Rosh, and he assumes that this get, according to the second side of Odilma, Kaven de lo Ovid Vamaimar lo, means that it's not a get kosher, but it definitely, if delivered to her, would pasal her for kahuna. And I believe that the logic here is on the side of Tosfos. The compelling logic is Tosfos. We had a case of Harei Ak Megureshes Mimeni, the Iad Muter S'chalana. And we said in that case, there's a Reach Haget and it passes for kahuna. In this case, the Rosh says, Af Eino Posel Es Yevamot L'Kahuna, if he delivers this get after Yibum. Why not? Get that was commissioned and written before the Yibum took place, after Nefila Yibum. Why is that garua? Why is it worse than Arei Muter S'chalana? So I believe that what the Rosh is saying is that Zikas Yibum is not a Gudula Ke'arusa, it's nothing. As far as Lishma, to create a get, it's not Biyadu L'Garsha, in the sense that there is no Ishus, or not enough Ishus at least to write a get. And therefore that get is completely possible. There's no Lishma. It's basically like a blank piece of. So where are we up to now? Oh, so according to the second side in the Gemara, if the get doesn't have So if the get is invalid according to the second side of the Gemara, then he could be miyabim. Okay. Why Rav Chanan? Now we have another suffix. Normally, as we said many times, if a Yavam does Maimar with his Yevamot, then subsequently, if he wants to break up that Maimar and undermine it, he needs to give her a get. So now we're talking about a case where the Yavam asa Maimar b'Yevimto, and then Kosav get, but he said, apparently made a verbal declaration that Lizikaso v'lo lemamar, that he wants this get to be mafkia the zika, but not to be mevatel the kinyan of maimar. That was his intention, explicitly pronounced at the time of the Nesinas Haget. Now we have a flip case. Lemamoro v'lo lizikasa. He wants this get to be effective, to be matter the kinyan of his maimar, but not to be mafkia the zika. Mal, does this get in these two scenarios have validity, a token? And it's going to be mafkia the maimar or the zika that he wants to be mafkia. So if the get was given to be mafkia the kinyan maimar, that's called lemamoro, then the Megarish could not be miyabim hub, but the other Yevamim, there are other brothers, they could be miyabim. However, if we're going to assume the get, which was given to be mafkia the kinyan maimar, is not mafkia the maimar bilvad. In other words, since he said that he wants just simply a get to be mafkia the maimar, that's not a valid get. He has, according to one side in Rav Chananya, he has basically invalidated this get by declaring that he just wants to be mafkia the maimar. It's a package deal. You cannot separate between the maimar and the kinyan maimar and the other dimension of Yibum, which is zika, lafkia says zika. And the nafkamina would be now that if the Megarish gives such a get, lafkia mamoro, but lo lafkia zika, so then he could be miyabim. The get is not valid. Now, if a get given by a yavam to his yavama is effective only to be megarish the zika, okay, this is a flip case where he says le zikasa v'lo lemamaro. So then he weakens the zika according to one side in Rabbi Chananya, and he generates an iser on the yavam. He cannot be miyabim. She'll need chalitza, but that's upgrade. That goes without saying. But he has blocked himself and asked himself for yibum. What should we say? No, that a get lizika bilvad is not effective. It's not a get, and therefore the megarish in quotation marks could be miyabim. And now Reb Chananya explains the study hasofi. Maimar, when the Rabbanu were metaking Maimar, what is Maimar? Ilave zika karami. It's not an independent kinyan that's created and generated by Maimar, but rather it's an extension that's built on the shoulders of zikas yibu. The havile, and if a person wants to give a get only to mafkia the maimar, but not the zika, or only the zika, not the maimar, it's like kimegarish chatzi isha. Of course, we're integrating these two elements: the element of the kinyan of maimar and the element of zika. They're both one indivisible entity, and he's being megarish chatzi. I'm a garish chatzi isha lo asa v'lo klum. It's not gerushin at all. That's called shir b'kinyano. So again, on this side, that we integrate both the kinyan mimer and the zikas yibum into one entity that's indivisible, cannot be split into two. If in the two cases of Reb Chananya, he, the Yavam, if he gave such a get, would be allowed to be miyabim, but the get is not chal. It's not, doesn't register. Dilma, hailuchudei koi. There are two different elements here. The mimer creates an element of a kinyan. The zika is a different element called zikas yibum. And they're independent one of the other. They stand each one unto themselves. And he can separate the two. He can give a get to be mafkir the zika. He could be mafkir the get to mafkir the kinyan maimah. So now the Gemara asks a question on Rav Chananya, who had a suffix and he vacillated about this. Whether there's a meaningful get l'maimer bilvad, v'tivshol le, midarava. Why couldn't Rav Chananya derive its conclusion from the words of Rav, which are expressed on the Mishnah back on Daf Lamed Aleph of Shlosha Achim and Esurim Shlosha Nashim, right there, Nashim Nachrios, Einom Achios, Meis Echad Mehem, Osa Echad Maimer B'Eishes HaMes, Umeskam hu sheishto vayevama shasaba maimer tzrichos chalitza. The Amar Rava, and Rava said that if before the death of the Yavam, who did a maimer nosan get lemamaro, he gave a get lemaimer v'lo lezika, hutra. Okay, what does the word hutra mean? Hutra isha eshes osa maimar. So rasa shalom isgareshes. V'ena sural of machmas soras eshes shnei mesim. So let's give a diagram of the case. There are three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, married. Reuven to Sarah, Shimon to Rivka, Levi to Rachel. Reuven dies, and Sarah falls for Yibum to Shimon and Levi. Shimon gave a get Shimon did Maimar with Sarah, and then Shimon died. This is the case of the Mishnah before Rav. So when Shimon dies, then both Sarah and Rivka fall for Yibum to Levi. But the problem is that since Shimon, before he died, did a mimer with Sarah, in the eyes of the spectator, it looks like Sarah is falling for Yibum from Shimon. In fact, on a Daraisa level, Sarah is falling for Yibum from Reuven. But since Shimon did a mimer in Sarah, it looks like Sarah is falling for Yibum from Shimon. Now Shimon's wife Rivka becomes a tzara of Sarah on this D'Rabbanan level as a result of the mimer. And then it looks like Eshet Shnei Mason, meaning that you have two women falling for Yibum from the same Yavam. And not only does Sarah become precluded from Yibum, but even Rivka Sarah is also precluded from Yibum. Comes along Rava, and Rava says, wait a minute. What happens if Shimon, after giving Maimer to Sarah, gave Sarah a get limamora? Says Rava, in such a case, Levi could be miyabim Rivka. Why? Because now, in the eyes of the spectator, since Shimon, after his mimer, he gave a get limamoro, and only limamoro, he removes the mimer. Sarah no longer looks like Eshes Shimon, and now it's not Eshes Shnei Mesim. It's not that Sarah is falling for Yibum from Shimon, and so is Rivka falling for Yibum from Shimon, but rather Sarah is falling for Yibum from Reuven and Rivka from Shimon, because he gave a get Limamoro, meaning Shimon, and he undermines and completely negates that so-called Ishus that he created through Maimar, and he gave a get specifically to remove that Ishus of Maimar. And yet Rava validates it. So the Gemara says, L'Rava pshitale, l'Rav Chananya mi boile mai. So although it's true, you have an excellent proof from Rava to establish that l'shitas Rava, if a person gives a get l'mamaro bilvad, the get is meaningful and valid to be mafkir the kinyan maimar, because that kinyan maimar is a separate, independent entity, independent of the zika. Nevertheless, Rav Chananya vacillated about that, and he wasn't sure. And the Gemara ends up with take news. I guess within the context of Chananya's suffix, we don't have an answer. We're not sure whether or not we can validate a get that's given limamoro to remove the kinyan maimar and not to remove the zika. The Mishnah tells us that if after he gave chalitza to the Yevamot, he did a maimar, so the maimar came after the chalitza, which is very odd when you think about it psychologically, why he would give a maimar after chalitza. Apparently he had a second doubts about what he did. And then after giving a chalitza, he gave a maimar, and then he gave her a get to remove the maimar. I guess you'd call it very fickle, Now, just, to top it off, after number one, chalitza, number two, maimar, number three, get, there he was baal, which means he wants to fulfill yibum. Which is very strange because he started with chalitza, but then on the other hand, he went over to maimar, but on the other hand, he gave her a get to the maimar. Now he's being boel. The Mishnah has another scenario in which he started with be'ilah, then he did a maimar, then he did a get to remove the maimar, then he gave a chalitza. And in all these cases, the Mishnah formulates a principle called ein achar maimar klum, or ein achar bia klum. And what that means is that when he starts with either be'ilah or chalita, which took place in these two scenarios that we mentioned, then whatever happens later is not registered at all. It's not chal. So, for example, he had chalitza, gave a chalitza, and then afterwards maimar. That maimar is not chal because ein achar chalitza klum, and therefore whatever he did with the maimar and then he gave her get, that's all irrelevant. So that's finito. In other words, chalitza is final. In the other scenario that we mentioned, he started with be'ilah. Ein achar be'ilah klum. So basically, you could say the following. If he started with chalitza, then the chalitza removes the zikas yibum entirely. All the other discussions that we had over the course of many blot work for situations where the zika was only removed partially. So there was room for something to be chal on the remnant of that chalitza. But in a case where he's remnant of that zika. But in the case where he started with chalitza and he removed the zika entirely, then there's no room for anything else to be chal. Alternatively, in the case where he started with be'ilah, there he was konahar kinyan gomor kashis each, and there's no more room for zika. The zika is completely removed. So again, the zika could be removed in one of two ways. When I talk about removal, I mean total removal, either through chalitza or through yibum, through be'ilah. So in a sense, we could say the following in summarizing the Mishnah: if he started with chalitza, then the Maimar after Chalitza is not a kinyan at all. Because after Chalitza, you remove the entire Zika, and then she becomes Eishes Ach. We go back to the original Erva situation in which there's no room for Maimar to be Chal. And if Maimar is not Chal and it doesn't register, then there's no need for a get after the Maimar. So she, in this case, would be Muteres L'Shuk, even though there was a Maimar and there was a get, because he started with Chalitza. Once he starts with Chalitza, Ein Acher Chalitza Klum. Amar Rav Yehuda Marav. Rav Yehuda, the name of Rav, throws in an entirely different perspective on this Mishnah, a whole new dimension. Zo Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Ti Omar Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Lavan, Aval Chachamim Omrim, Yesh Achar Chalitza Klum. What basically Rav is going to do now, by introducing the Chachamim as a dissenting view in terms of the halacha of HaMishnah, the Chachamim now are going to assume, according to Rav, that Maimar is Kona B'Yevamot, and that becomes Kiddushei Torah. Why? Because even though he began with Chalitza, after Chalitza removes the Yibum and the Zika of Yibum, she becomes like a Pnuya. And the halacha is that Imlo Yivne, the Torah says Imlo Yivne, and the Gemara darshans Kevon Shelo Bana Shuvlo Yivne. Once he refused Yibum and he gave a Chalitza, then what happens is he closes the door on Yibum. He no longer has an option of Yibum, but now he's only Asur B'Lav. It's only a violation of Allah. So why does our Mishnah maintain that Ein Liachar Chalitza Klum, and the Maimar that came subsequent to Chalitza does not register at all and there's no need for a get? She's not married to him. That's because our Mishnah should be attributed to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva has a unique shita that Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Lavim. We hold like Chachamim that Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Krisus. Again, there's another shita, Rabbi Yeshua, that Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Misa. But let's go with Rav Shimon Hatimni. His view is a middle shita that it depends on Chayvei Krisus. So now, after Chalitza, her status vis-a-vis the Yavam is that of Chayvei Lavim. And since it's Chayvei Lavim, it now depends upon the machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. Our Mishnah, says Rav, reflects the Shita Rabbi Akiva. After Chalitza, she's Chayvei Lavim. The Maimar now is not Tofes. She doesn't need to get to the Maimar because Ein Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Lavim. Masha Ein Kain, according to the Chachamim, they hold that Kiddushin Tovsim B'chayvei Lavim, and if the Maimar following the Chalitza generates we'll call it an illegitimate ishus, but it's ishus nevertheless. It's a kinyan ishus, and that requires a get. So the Gemara now raises the following objection to Rav. Umi matzis mukile ki Rabbi Akiva. We have a principle that a Mishnah is to be viewed as an integral whole. You cannot split a Mishnah into two parts and say that one part of the Mishnah reflects this sheet and the other part reflects a different dissenting view. We have to maintain the integrity of the Mishnah. And now the Gemara is going to say that I'm going to prove to you, not from this part of the Mishnah, but from an earlier part of the Mishnah, that the Mishnah does not reflect the sheet and cannot be reconciled with the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Umi matzis mukmis la ki Rabbi Akiva. Vaktani Reisha, at the beginning of the Mishnah, when the Yavam gave a get to his Yevama, and then after the get, also Maimar, and the Mishnah establishes that Sricha get, that now she needs a second get. The first get he gave even before Maimar. Once he gives Maimar subsequent to the first get, she needs a second get to be matir her. Not only that, the get itself will not be mafkia zika on a doraisa level. Get is only effective in a yavam midrabanon. We go back to the doraisa, and her zikas yibam is still alive and active on a doraisa level. She needs chalitza, so she'll need now twice. She'll need both get lemamoro and chalitza lezikasa in order to allow her to get married. Rabbi Akiva, if you're going to tell me that our Mishnah is attributed to Rabbi Akiva, Kaven diyov get, once he gave her a get, mimahani be maimar. How could maimar be effective to be kona? And we're going to prove now that once she gets a get, according to Rabbi Akiva, maimar is not going to be kona, because with the get, she becomes a surah olav be'isur lav, and ein kiddushin tovsim b'chayvei lavin. Hatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rabbi Akiva Omer minayin l'nosen get liavinto shenesra olav olamis. Rabbi Akiva has a very unique shita that if a yavam delivers a get to his wife, meaning to his yavama, he could never marry her again, and a marriage now is also midin chayvei lavin shenemar lo yuchal bailo rishon asher shilcha. The Pasuk Pshat in this Pasuk is referring to what's called Machzir Grushaso. That if a man divorces his wife and she gets married to another man who subsequently either dies or gives her a get, the original husband is enjoined from marrying his Grushaso after she's Nises Liacher with an Isalah. But Rabbi Akiva takes this Pasuk in a totally different context. And the Torah says, Bailo Harishon. And these two words, Baila Rishon, in the context, we'll have to open up a chumash and see it inside, are redundant. And Rabbi Akiva darshans these two redundant words, Baila Rishon, as if the pasuk here is introducing another Iser. One Iser, which is Machzir Grushaso, and another Iser, which is a Yavama who received a get from the Yavam, and therefore the Yavam is called, again, you have to put it in quotation marks, he's called Baila Harishon because there was a Zikas Yibum, and now he delivered her a get. He is not allowed to now be miyabim her after he gave her a get, and that's a lav no rice according to Rabbi Akiva. Achar shiluach. Shiluach means get, after he gave her a get. So now we see that according to Rabbi Akiva, the bichayve lavim in a case of a man who is a yavam and delivered a get to his yavam, and now he marries her, he violates a lav, is ein kedushin tofsin, and therefore the mimer that comes subsequent to a get, according to Rabbi Akiva, would not generate a need for a get. Bad enough he gave her one get; he doesn't have to give her a second get because the mimer doesn't register. Because Rabbi Akiva holds ein kedushin tofsin b'chayve lavim. And Baila Rishon generates an Isser Lav in the case of a Yavama who received a get from the Yavam. After that, the Kedushin are invalid according to Rabbi Akiva because Rabbi Akiva darshans a separate Lav for a Machzir Grushaso in a Yivam situation. The Gemara answers, Omer of Ashi, there's no kasha from this brisa on the Mishnah, which establishes that Maimer is Kona B'Yavama after the get. Why? Because get Yavamin midrabanon ukra asmachta b'alma. The entire episode of Rabbi Akiva's drasha, in which he derives the conclusion that there's an Iser on the Yavam to be B'Yavim after he delivered a get, that's only an asmachta, that's only a din d'Rabbanon. It's not a drasha gemura. And therefore, Kedushin are Tovsin according to Rabbi Akiva because it's only an Isa D'Rabbanan. Even Rabbi Akiva holds that Kedushin Tosin B'Chayvei Lavin admits that in the case of an Isa D'Rabbanan, the Kedushin are Tofes. Hence, if after the get he gives a Maimar, she needs another get for that Maimar because the status of the Yevama after receiving the first get is only an Iser D'Rabbanan. Rabbi Akiva derives it from the two extra words, Baila Rishon. That's only an Asmachta D'Rabbanan. What is an Asmachta D'Rabbanan? Again, just to go over what we know from our basic childhood, that even though the Torah permits it, we're going to find a remez, some sort of an allusion in the words of the Torah to indicate that the Rabbanan are authorized to go beyond the halacha of the Torah, the Doraisa law, and that's called an asmachta. And the Rishonim tell us that an asmachta is more powerful than a regular classic D'Rabbanan, because the Torah, in a sense, with that asmachta, gave a little bit of a license, a green light to the Chachamim to go ahead and institute their injunction on a D'Rabbanan level. Tanya Nami Hachi, we have a brisa to support this sheet of Rav, that the Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Akiva. Amar Rabbi, Ein advarim alolu amurim el divrei Rabbi Akiva. When the Mishnah says that after chalitza, the get that he delivers her is meaningless, and she doesn't require anything to, the get doesn't register, and the mimer doesn't register after chalitza, because ein achar chalitza klum. That's only l'divrei Rabbi Akiva. Shaya oseh chalutza ke'erva. When Rabbi Akiva established after chalutza, there's an iser lav of kevon shalobana shuvlo yivne. That lav undermines the maimar. The maimar kedushin cannot be chal because of chayvei lavim, and therefore chalutza is like an erva. Meaning chalutza, according to Rabbi Akiva, is like an erva according to the chachamim. Just like ein kedushin tostin ba'arayos, which means chayvei krisus, that's according to the Rabbanan of Rabbi Akiva. So to Rabbi Akiva, in the case of chalutza, by virtue of the lav of lo yivne, is like an erva. There's no kedushin tostin, hence she does not require a get lemamara because ein achar chalitza klum.
Why does Rabbi Akiva call it like an erva? It is an erva. He did chilutza, so that woman is now free to go into the shuk. And Rabbi
I'll tell you what I think he means here. What's unique about an erva is that we have different dinim that are generated by an erva. I'll give you one example. In the case of an erva, there's an iser yichud d'oraisa. I don't believe for a minute that according to Rabbi Akiva, that iser yichud d'oraisa would apply to chayvei lavin, because chayvei lavin is not an erva. Tfisas kedushin, on the other hand, that's a different halacha. You have to have a legitimate marriage to be valid. And Rabbi Akiva says that chayvei lavim is an illegitimate marriage, and that blocks the tfisas kedushin. She doesn't need a get, but she's not an erva. She's like an erva according to the Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan hold that there are two nafkaminas to the shem erva. One is yichud d'oraisa, and the other is tfisas kedushin. So the Rabbanan say that what blocks the kedushin is an erva relationship. Now, the big question you have to ask, and this, Dr. Joel, is a major sugya, what would be the status of the child, according to Rabbi Akiva, who is born a chayvei lavin? Is the child a mamzer, or in the case of an akeva, mamzeres? Does mamzeres depend upon shem erva, or does mamzeres depend upon tfisas kedushin, which is basically the sugya earlier in this parak about akum v'eved abba al bas Yisrael. You may recall that there are two opinions whether the vlad is a mamzer or not. If we say that tfisas kedushin generates mamzerus, that would apply to the child of an akum, where the father is a god. If, on the other hand, what generates mamzeris is the chumras havera, the shem erva, then that doesn't apply to guy abal bas yisrael, which is not. I don't even know if it's a chiv malchus. I mean, you have to. Aval chachamim omrim yesh achar chalitza klum. The maimar is chal after chalitza. Why? Because chalitza only generates an itzel lav, and kedushin tovsim b'chayvei lavin. Therefore, the maimar is valid. So she needs a get l'mamoro. And now comes Rebbe with his own shita. Aval ani omer, I hold that the law is very, very complicated. There's no simple answer to this machlokas between Chachamim and Rabbi Akiva as to how it impacts on a maimar after chalitza. And he says the following. Amosai, let's distinguish between the following two scenarios. Bisman shekitchel l'shum ishus, as opposed to kitchel l'shum yevamus or yavmus. Okay. Says Rabbi, I'm willing to accept the chachamim that kedushin tovsin after chalitza, but only in a case where he's mekadosh l'shem ishus. Now, let's understand. When a person does a maimar, you can define the maimar in one of two ways. Either the maimar is like ishus di alma. Again, we're talking about a case of maimar and Yevamot. Or you could say no, that the maimar is built upon and is an extension of the zikas yibum. And a similar distinction, I wouldn't equate them, but it's analogous, is what the Chachamim are saying here in the name of Rebbe. In other words, Rebbe's understanding of the Shitas Chacham. When a person does a maimar after chalitza, what is he thinking? Is his maimar an extension of zikas yibum, which again is a major mistake, a fallacy on his part? That's a fallacious assumption. He already gave a chalitza. There ain't no zikas yibum. But in his mind, again, we have to send him for therapy, but in his mind, he believes that the zikas yibum is still intact. And therefore, he builds the maimar on that zika that is a remnant, a shirayim of the chalitza. That's called kidsha l'shum yevamos. The Masechet writes, Savar, so the Masechet is getting into the psychology of the man. Shadayin zikas yibum alel. What a mistake. The man doesn't know what chalitza is all about. So in his mind, there's still room for yibum because there's still a zika. He was mekadosh her to build on the zika, to extend the zika and make it into full-fledged ishus. In such a case, says Rebbe, ein achar chalitza klum. There's no room for maimar. In a case where he was mekadosh l'shem yavus, because the underlying premise of his marriage is completely fallacious. There ain't no zika after chalitza. How can he build an ishus on chalitza? But now we have a different story. And the story that we're dealing with now is that he understands full well that after chalitza there ain't no zika. What did he mean by this maimar? He was mekadosh kedushin b'alma. What do I mean by kedushin b'alma? Shem ishus. He's starting from 0 going to 100. Not like the case of L'Shem Yavus where he starts with 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever it is, and goes from there to 100. So in that case, since he's well aware that he's starting from scratch, and after chalitza there's no zikas yibum, he's being mekadosh l'shem ishus, is then we look at Chayve Lavin. After Chalitza, Kavan Shalo Bana Shuv Lo Yivne, he violates the Lavin Lo Yivne. But we're holding now like Chacham because Rebbe accepted the Shitas Chacham against Rabbi Akiva that Kedushin Tovsim V'Chayve Lavin. Hence, if he did the Maimar, or we'll call it Kedushin, Shem Ishus, starting from a clean slate, then she needs a get to remove the Ishus of Maimar. It's Chayve Lavin, Kedushin Tovsim V'Chayve Lavin. So to that extent, Rebbe accepts the sheet of the Chachamim. And if that be the case, our Mishnah could not be reconciled with the Chachamim because he did a Maimer L'Shem Ishus, and as a result, since Kedushin Tosu B'Chayve Lavin, she needs a get. So what's Ein Achar Chalitza Klum? The answer is that Ein Achar Chalitza Klum is in a case where the Bala Maimer, the Yavam, who gave Kedushin, is of the opinion that he's going to extend the Zika to a full-fledged Yibum Ishus, and that he can't do. And since he can't do it, we apply the principle of Ein Achar Chalitza Klum. I'm not sure. What I'm going to tell you now is very iffy, but I suspect that what Rebbe is talking about in the case of Mekadesh Hashem Yavmus is Mekachtos. But again, it's complicated. There are two different, shall I say, two roads that diverged in Mekachtos. Mekachtos could be one of two things. Mekachtos could mean that he doesn't want the result, right? He wanted to buy chitim and he ended up with siorim. But there's another halach of Mekachtos, which means that according to the way he understood the kinyan, the Maisa kinyan is invalid. Again, he'd be very happy with the results. If you told him, my friend, you're married to your chalutza, he would dance from the rooftops. So that's not the mekachtos of chitin and siorin, but it's a different halacha mekachtos. In his understanding, the Maisa Kiddushin is built on Zika, and that it cannot be because the chalitza removed the Zika. That's a different halacha mekachtos. And his maimar is invalid, and he doesn't need, and she doesn't need a get. And if the Mishnah says Ein Achar Chalitza Klum, it's referring to a Makadesh who thinks that Yesh Achar Chalitza. He thinks that even after Chalitza, he can be Makayim Yibum. He made a mistake, he gave a Chalitza, but now he set the record straight. In such a case, his mimer is meaningless, and it's not chal, and it has nothing to do with whether Kedushin and Tovsim b'chayvei lavim or not. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa, and the brisa quotes Rebbe and Chachamim, Hacholeitz liyavimto v'chazar v'kidsha. Rebbe Omer, it depends. Im kidsha l'shum ishus, fine. Again, he violated an Iser Doraisa of Lo Yivne, but Kedushin Tosam B'chayvei Lavin. And therefore, Tzrichai Menu get the Kedushin Atofes B'chayvei Lavin. And in that sense, Rebbe rejects Rabbi Akiva. However, L'shum Yavus, if he thinks that the Zikas Yibum is still intact, even after Chalitza, and he still has an option of upgrading the Zika to a full-fledged Ishus, that's called Kidesh L'Shem Yavnus, then my friend, you're way, way off the map here, the halachic map, because you're creating an Ishus that doesn't exist. There ain't no Ishus that's built on Zika after Chalitza. It's ain't no Tzricha Menu Get. We called it Kiddushay Tos. Again, that has to be taken under advisement. The Chachamim Omrim, it doesn't matter one way or the other. Ben Shekitzel Shem Ishus. Is Sricha Heimenu Get. This is not a mekachtos. No matter what the man thinks in his mind, he didn't go to the Daf Yomi Shir and Yevamot, so he didn't realize that after Chalitza you can't create a Yibum relationship because there's no Zika left after Chalitza. Chalitza completely undermines the Zika. But at the end of the day, he gave her kesef, he gave her a shtar. And he said, Areat Mekudeshesli, he said the magic words. He wants to be married to her. There's no mekachos. And since Kedushin Tosim b'chayvei lavim in the case of a chalutza, therefore she needs a ger. So if you would ask me, where do we place Rebbe on this map? I would say Rebbe is very much anchored in the sheet of the Chachamim against Rabbi Akiva. So in the fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan, that's where Rebbe agrees to the Rabbanan, against Rabbi Akiva. There's an inner machlokus about Makadesh with a Maimar L'Shem Yevamot, where Rebbe introduces a new concept called Mekakos, and the Rabbanan reject it. Omar Rav Yosef, my time of the Rebbe. Why is it that in this case we apply the principle of Tos when he mistakenly thought that he could build on the Zika? And the Gemara answers, this is a very, very lumdishes sugya. Because we have to talk about Tos in two directions. One is a Tos in the Chalos, and one is a Tos in the Maisa. We'll try to explain. Asa'u, according to Rebbe, ke'oder b'nichsei hager v'kasavar shalohen, the low cunning. Now, nichsei hager, if there are no relatives to the ger, that means he didn't leave any children, are hefker. And now there's a piece of karka, and one of the ways of achieving a kinyan chazaka is by hoeing the land. That's called ma'ader, which is a tolda on Shabbos of Charisha. He goes down to Nichsei Ager, and he doesn't realize that these nechasim are hefker. He accidentally thinks there are two contiguous fields, and he moves the boundary. I don't mean literally, but in his mind, he moves the boundary of his field a little bit into the Nichsei Ager. Had he only known that he was doing a ma'ader, an either in Nichsei Ager, he would have had kavanas kinyan. He would have had the intention of the chalos kinyan to be konim in a hefker, because he's doing a chazaka on hefker. And karka niknes b'chazaka. But in his mind, he was hoeing his own backyard. So he didn't have any kavanah l'shem kinyan. Low cunning. Now, let's see if we can figure out the analogy here that Rav Yosef is making between Rebbe's Makadish L'Shem Yevamos and the case of Ma'adir B'nichsei Hager V'kasavar Shem Shalom. In the case of L'Shem Yevamos, according to Rebbe, he's not interested in a Maisa Kedushin. He thinks he's fulfilling his mitzvah of Yibum. And despite the fact that he had already given a chalitza, he still has the option to build on that zika. And the Torah allowed him to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum and marry this woman even after chalitza. That's his mindset. Had he known that that's an impossibility, he certainly would have had in mind Shem Kedushin. But the only intention that could be chal after chalitza and ishus is l'shem ishus. If he would have been aware of a certain halachic fact, namely that chalitza removes zika entirely, and the only option he has to marry this woman would be with ishus, which the Torah prohibits, but nevertheless it would be chal, he certainly would have said, hey, rah, 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 I'm in favor of ishus. And the Gemara equates that with hama'adim v'nichsei hager kasavar shem shalom, because had he only known that this field, or the part of that field, belongs to the ger, and it's hefker after his death, he would have had in mind l'shem kinyan. So we have a situation in which a person is doing an action which is meaningless based on his own understanding of the action and its meaning. But had he been aware of what were the halachic legal facts and the repercussions of his action, he would have had in mind l'shem chalos kinyan. And the halacha is lo kana, that in the case where he didn't have in mind l'shem kinyan, his ma'isa chazaka doesn't register. And so too, when he had in mind l'shem yivmus, which is an absolutely absurd entity. This is irrelevant to Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbana. There's no such thing as Yevamos after Chalitza, my friend. So he says, well, wait a minute. I didn't realize that. Had you told me that, had I gone to the Daf Yomi shir that day, I certainly would have had in mind L'Shem Ishus. No go. Had you told me that this piece of karka belonged to the ger, I would have had in mind L'Shem Chazak of Kinyan. No go. Lokon. That's not a valid analogy. Hasam in the case of Nichse Ager, Lo Kamachavi Lemikne, he didn't have in mind Ma'aseh Kinyan. He thought he was hoeing his backyard. Hacha, Kamachavi Lemikne. What is he interested in? He wants a chalos ishus. Albeit, admittedly, in a fakrumta way. I mean, this is not how you create ishus by having in mind yibum. You know, yibum is not operative after chalitza, but you have to grant me that he had in mind a kinyan. Given his understanding, he wants a ma'aseh kinyan.
Is there not a case, I vaguely remember, someone fell on top of a lady and did an act of bia by accident, and yet that's Mekayim, the mitzvah of Yivam?
Right, he
so
fell from a roof.
There's no machshava whatsoever in the Yibum. So there's room to say his machshava shouldn't make any difference here.
No, that's, Dr. Joel, that's only true when there's a zikas yibum. If there's no zikas yibum, then you need das mekadesh, classic das kinyan. The problem is that he didn't have in mind the classic das kinyan. So Abai says it doesn't matter because he had in mind the kinyan. He was involved in an action of kesef and shtar, which he gave for the sake of a kinyan. All right, he thought that this was a ma'aseh yibum and not a ma'aseh kinyan, but he definitely had in mind hineni muchan mizuman, you know, liyuchtish. What does it say? Liyuchtish shvei the for the sake of a kinyan ishus. He wants a kinyan ishus. He's not playing games here. He's not hoeing his backyard. There is a ma'aseh kinyan, and there's a rotzon and a das for the chalos kinyan. He changes one screw over there. He thinks that, you know what, this is a kinyan through the methodology of Yibum. But he definitely wants a kinyan. But if you don't even know you're making a kinyan, you didn't even have das to create a ma'aseh kinyan. So that's why I think the Abai is being mechalik here. You need das for a ma'aseh kinyan. Could be that the ma'aseh kinyan that you're performing operates in a different way than what you think it's performed. But you definitely had in mind a ma'aseh kinyan. Ask him what he wants at the end of the day. What's his agenda? To where does he want to achieve at the goal? The goalpost in football, right? The goal line here is ishus. He wants a kinyan ishus. But if you don't know that it belongs to someone else, there's no way in under the stars that you can tell me he wants a kinyan ishus. That's Abaye. As Abaye, I'll give you the case where, if you want to talk about nichse ger, it's analogous to our case of l'shem yibnus. Lo damya elo oder b'nichse ger zeh, because sover shall ger acheru. He realizes full well that he's making a kinyan on hefker, but he didn't know whose hefker it was. Was the hefker this ger or hefker that ger? Dekani. The halacha is clearly, nobody doubts it, that he's kona. He had in mind a ma'aseh kinyan. He's not hoeing in his his own backyard. What difference does it make? Okay, so there's a method of kinyan to be kona from so-and-so, and a method of kinyan to be kona from so-and-so. So in both cases, he's kona. So now Abaye is stuck against a brick wall because he now has to find some sort of a basis for Shitas Rebbe that Maimer L'Shem Yibus does not register, and there's no need for a get. Omar Abaye, Abaye says, we go back to a different halacha in Kedusha. We've been talking about a Maisa Kedusha, we've been talking about a Chalos Kedusha issues. What about the Lashon Kedusha? There's a separate halacha of Lashon Kedusha. Otherwise, it's Dvarim Shebelev and Dvarim Shebelev lo havi Dvarim. Hachamayaskinon. What's the case of Rebbe? Kegon di Omar La, when he gave her kesef and shtar, what magical words came out of his mouth after he had given her chalitza? Is kadshi li b'maymar Yevamot. I want the chalos ishus to be generated by a maymar Yevamot. Sorry, no go. There's no such thing as a maymar Yevamot. After chalitza, there's no maymar Yevamot. Now the Masechet adds another twist here, which I didn't see this in the Pshat in the Gemara. He says, Kevon she'omar b'feirush, I assume you have that in front of you. She'rotze she'yachulu ba kedushay maymar, lo rotze she'yachulu alav kedushay Torah. He's saying the following: there are two kinds of kedusha. There's kedushay Torah, which in the case of Chayvei Lavin we hold is tofes, and then there's something called kedushay mamar, which is a rabbinic invention in the case of Yevamot. The Torah doesn't recognize kedushay mamar. So what now becomes the machlokas between Rebbe and the Chachamim? Rebbe Sovar Maimar iluye zika karam. When a person gives kedushin, kesef or shtar, with an explicit declaration, and he pronounces this is maimar, what he means to say is that it's not a kinyan in of itself, but rather it's that takonis chachamim of maimar, which means that you upgrade the zika to a level of ishus, which obviously he can't do after chalitza. Hence, Rebbe says that he, through his amira, has undermined the Maisa Kedushin. The Maisa Kedushin of Harei at Mekudeshes Li B'Kedushay Maimar is not a Maisa Kedushin at all after chalitza. Because the Rabbanan said we'll recognize that Maimar as a method of creating issues if there's a Zika. But if there's no Zika, then the whole Maimar is out the window. So when he makes a declaration that I'm being Mekadesh you with Amira Shel Maimar, that Amira Shel Maimar invalidates his Maisa Kiddush. V'asoi chalitza v'afke l'zika, since unbeknown to him, the Zika was completely undermined and neutralized as a result of chalitza. Therefore, the whole entity of Maimar doesn't exist. The Rabbanan created an entity, an enterprise of Maimar when there is a Zika. But Kiddushay Maimar don't exist in the case of post chalitza because there's no Zika. And Maimar is built on, and as we said before, is an extension of Zika. Rabbanan Savri, Hai lechudei koi, v'hai lechudei koi. You misunderstood, Rebbe. You misunderstood the entire enterprise of Maimar, which was created by the Rabbanan. You think that Maimar is an extension of Zika. No, that's not so. The Rabbanan said that if he gives a kesef or shtar from the Yomi to the Yevamot, it's basically like Ishus, like Kiddushay Torah, Kiddushin the Alma. And the Rabbanan created Maimar as a separate entity, totally independent of Zika. Hai lechudei koi, v'hai lechudei koi. The Zika is one thing, and the Kiddushay Maimar another thing. So when he says to the Yevamot, Harei at mekudeshes li b'kesef o shtar zeh Kiddushay Maimar, that's a kinyan unto itself. a kinyan ishus of maimar, which the Rabbanan created. What should I say? It's similar to like Tanosh and his Kadsha al Yidei Avia. I'm sorry, al Yidei Ima, al Yidei Achea. The Rabbanan could create their own, it's a Yitzur Kappa of the Rabbanan to create a brand new design, a whole new entity of Ishus called Maimar. And the Rabbanan say that if he wants a kinyan Maimar, then it depends. If we hold Ein Kedushin Tosa B'Chayvi Lavim, it's out, but we hold like the Chacham Kedushin Tosa B'Chayvi Lavim, hence she needs again. Hai L'chudei Koi V'hai L'chudei Koi. And therefore, Meikara, Ilu Amalas Kachili B'Maimer Yevamim Milo Mahani, he wants Maimar. And Maimar creates a separate kinyan, Midrabanan, of course, called Kedushin Maimar, and that's what he wanted. And if Kedushin Tosa B'Chayvi Lavim, that's what he's going to get. It's Hashtanami Mahani, therefore, after Chalitza, even though there's no more Zika, nevertheless, there is Kedushay Maimar, and he creates that separate independent kinyan of Kedushay Maimar. That's Abai. And now, just to finish it up with Rava, Rava doesn't want to accept Abai. To say the machlokas here is about whether Maimar is the high l'chudei koi, or Maimar is an extension of Zika. I don't see that in this machlokas. And therefore, Iti Amarla b'Maimar Yevamin, we're all going to agree that high l'chudei koi v'high l'chudei koi, kuli amalo pligid mahanya. Even Rebbe would agree that kinyan on a Drabanan level is chal and she needs a get because there's Maimar b'Yevamin as a separate entity, a separate new kinyan issues that was created by the Rabbanan, fashioned in their image. So what is Rebbe arguing about? Hachamayas kinin could go diamar law is kachi li bezikas Yevamin, not b'Maimar Yevamin, but bezikas Yevamin. If you're asking whether a lashon could mess up and undermine the kedushin, here you hit the jackpot, because he says explicitly that this kedushin is zikas Yevamin. I want to upgrade the zikas Yevamin by giving you kesef and shtar. Is a maimar of kedushin, right? There's a whole sugya on the vav in kedushin. What constitutes a maimar in kedushin? I'm talking about kedushin the alma. He says harei keduyali, harei miuchedesli, harei zkukali, etc., etc. A whole list of cases. Now the man says, harei at mikudeshes li b'maimar Yevamim. Says Rebbe, oh, no. That can't be. There's no such thing as zikas Yevamim after chalitza. If he would have said, maybe I made a mistake. If he would have said, Harei Mikudeshli b'Maimar Yevamim, then everybody agrees there's a kinyan Maimar as a separate independent entity. But he said, Harei Mikudeshli b'Zikas Yevamim. I'm building my ishus and my kinyan on the Zika, says Rebbe, and here we turn to Daf Nun Gimel, Yesh Zika. That there's something called Zika, which is very powerful, and you could build on that Zika, and that's called Maimar Midrabanan. That's only before Chalitza. But now we're talking about a case, says Rebbe, of after Chalitza. Osi Chalitza v'afka'atel and Zika. The Zika is gone. It's history. And therefore, he cannot be Makadish her with a Zikas Yevamim, because there ain't no Zika. So the Lashon itself torpedoes the entire entity out of the water. For Rabbanan Savri, ain't Zika. This is a big sugya, but the Rabbanan hold there's no such thing as Zika, which means that there is a Zika. Everybody agrees there's a Zika, but it means Zika is not that powerful enough. And therefore, Meikara, before Chalitza, Ilu Amalais Kachili Bezikas Yevamim Milo Mahani, is Hashtanami Mahani. Just like before, he gave a chalitza, he can be mekadisha with zikas Yevamim, because that zika is very limited, and therefore he can build on the zika. So the language of zikas Yevamim is meaningful. It's meaningful even after chalitza. Why? Because the Zika to begin with, from the get-go, was not really a strong Zika. And therefore, the Lashon of Zikas Yevamim is to be interpreted as a Maimon. And once you upgrade the status of Hareyat Mekudeshesli Bezikas Yevamim to the level of a Lashon Ishus, that can apply even after Chalitza, because nothing radically changed as far as Maimer is concerned between before Chalitza and after Chalitza. So this is where we'll stop for today. And Mitzvah tomorrow we'll learn Daf Nun Gimel. I know you have a Chavrusa, so I'm not expecting to see you. In case you change your mind, just let me know beforehand. All right.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Hopefully I'll see you at 10:45.
Excellent. Great. We'll see you then. And then we'll learn a little bit of Chulin, Masechet Chulin, an introduction to Masechet Chulin.